The topic and subject of borders is one that is very relevant today. We debate what the borders are or should be to our country. We talk about the borders of relationships, of how far is appropriate and what types of borders and boundaries we need to set with other people. Borders always seem to be an important topic and a difficult one for us to navigate. And it's one that Jesus talks about a lot in today's gospel reading, which is why I titled this message, Along the Borders. There's a couple of people who are along the borders in this reading in a couple of different ways. First, it seems that the foreigner is along the borders. He comes from a different country, a different place, and seems to be outside of that particular country, geographically or politically speaking. But essentially not only him, but all of the lepers are along the borders in a slightly different way in regards to the fact of the communities that they want to be involved in. The biggest problem for the lepers, even beyond the physical pain and suffering that they have to experience as a result of having this disease of leprosy, is that of being ostracized from society. Under Jewish law, people with leprosy were considered to be unclean, ceremonially, and as a result would be separated from the rest of society, because anyone who touched one of them would become unclean themselves, and no one wanting to take that risk, no one would go near any of them, whether they were foreigners or not, as most of them in this case were not. And thus, Jesus does in this story what he does in many healings. He simultaneously does two things. He makes them clean. Jesus says to them, "Go and be clean." And in that, he means that they can now return to society and be accepted. Once they go to the priest, and the priest realizes that they no longer have leprosy, they will no longer be considered unclean, and they will be welcomed back into the community once again. Thus, fundamentally, Jesus' healings are about creating and establishing new communities. That's a more immediate problem for them even than the disease is. But Jesus also does something significant in his healings. Very often, Jesus heals by touching. In this reading, we're not explicitly told that Jesus touched them, but the fact that Jesus is willing to interact with them makes it entirely possible that he did. And elsewhere, in other healings, we are explicitly told that Jesus touches them. Jesus, by touching people with leprosy, makes himself unclean as well, in order to identify himself with those at the bottom of society, as making a statement that even though the rest of society had put you away as being unclean, as being impure, as being beyond what we want to deal with, Jesus is not willing to say that. He's willing to go to these people and even to make himself unclean so as to identify himself with them. So he identifies himself with this community, but he also brings them back into the larger community. And this, of course, includes the foreigner in this case. He's bringing the foreigner into the community of Israel and into the community of God, a place he was never thought to have had a place in before, and a place he certainly would not even have expected to be able to go to. Thus, Jesus is also fighting prejudice in this way. The prejudice that some people are at the bottom of society, are unclean, are unfit for our love, protection, and even spending time with. These are the people who Jesus clung to throughout his ministry. The main critique from the leaders in Jewish society against Jesus for spending time with people such as tax collectors, prostitutes, lepers, others that society had left behind, was that these people are unclean and that dignified people cannot go around them. Jesus shatters that presence by his healing, and he also brings new communities together by doing this, which is what we need to do today as well. Think about those who our society views as unclean, beyond our love, beyond our protection, beyond our spending time with and having a presence with. Those are the people Jesus cares most about, and the people he most wants us to identify ourselves with. Jesus' miracles are also pointing ahead to something else and something more. Oftentimes, we're so focused on the healing itself that we don't recognize what it's pointing to. I kind of give an analogy of it's like if you ever have a pet and you want the pet to look at something and you point at it and it just stares at your finger the whole time, right? You say, no, the finger is not the point. It's just a sign. It's pointing you towards something else. But we can get so caught up looking at the sign that we don't realize what the sign is actually pointing to. And that often happens with Jesus' miracles. Jesus' miracles are a sign of the launch of new creation. That's something new and different and exciting is happening. In the first reading today in 2 Kings, when the king gets word of the man with leprosy, he says, how could I possibly heal him? And, are you crazy? How could you think I could do something like that? We often hear that people in the ancient world, all believed in miracles and this was nothing out of the ordinary. But that's simply not true. As the first reading shows, people would have been shocked at a person being healed. People would have laughed at the idea that a person with leprosy could just simply be healed. One of the great controversies or debates between the Pharisees and the Sadducees was that the Sadducees rejected the idea of resurrection, or that there could be a life after death or anything like that. These type of things were certainly not an idea accepted by everyone in those societies. So the fact that this is something shocking to society that no one would expect shows that it's a sign that something new and different is coming that can disrupt our normal ways of living and make things different. And of course, the launch of new creation means that new communities are possible, and that the creation and reconciliation of these communities are possible as well. It would have seemed impossible to these lepers that they could again become part of this community. And it certainly would have seemed impossible to the foreigner that he could have been integrated into this community. Which, again, he's standing along the borders in more ways than one. The geographical borders, the political borders, the social borders, the borders in terms of culture, in terms of acceptance, in terms of cleanliness, and so forth, and prejudice. In all these ways, he's standing along the borders. And Jesus is willing to make those borders more porous and allow him into the kingdom of God. And in so doing, Jesus is creating new, diverse, multi-ethnic communities in so many different ways here, which is a sign of new creation and a sign that something different is happening here. This is in a sense a profoundly political statement, because the Roman emperors of the day would have loved to be able to create these communities. Anyone who ever tries to organize things knows that getting people with severe differences that seem to separate them to work together is an incredibly difficult task, and it's one that seemed to be impossible. Thus, to have these type of communities exist is sort of a statement to the leaders of the day that new creation has been launched, that this is a threat to your power, your normal ways of existing, and that you wish you could have done that, but we have it here. Well, you never actually could accomplish it. It's a profoundly political statement because if Jesus is Lord, that means that Caesar isn't in that way. And thus, this is a case not simply of tolerance, as we might think of it, but of expansion. Jesus' message fundamentally is that the kingdom of God is establishing God's rule on earth. Really, the best way to think about the kingdom of God is not an object or an entity, but a fact. The fact of God's rule on earth. And that we hear throughout the prophets, throughout the Psalms, and so forth, that God will rule the earth from one sea to another in that way. That the kingdom of God will be extended throughout the earth. And Jesus' message here is that that power comes in a very different way. Jesus completely redefines power. Instead of thinking of it in terms of dominance, of asserting your will against others, Jesus becomes a servant. Rather than demanding that others come up to his level, he meets them where they are at. He's even willing to make himself unclean and associate himself with those at the bottom of society who have been rejected in order to reach out to them. This is the type of power and expansion that Jesus talks about when it comes to the kingdom of God. So different from the empires, both ancient and modern, that want to use force to impose their will in that way. The vision of the prophets, of the Psalms, of the scriptures in general, was that one day the Gentiles would give up their idolatry and come to worship the God of Israel. And this is exactly the vision that Jesus is tapping into here. To bring foreigners into the kingdom of God. To open the borders to everyone. To not let the borders that had traditionally kept people out come in anymore. And in so doing, he's also expanding the borders. As the borders become larger, the community becomes larger. And this new, diverse, multi-ethnic, and different in every possible way community begins to exist and begins to grow. This was God's vision given to the prophet and his vision for the church today as well. His vision was that when the Messiah would come, he would not just be the Messiah for Israel, but the Messiah for the entire world. And in so doing, he's able to bring these communities together and bring them together in that way. Most significantly here, by creating communities, Jesus fundamentally reaches people where they're at. rather than demanding that they come to the standard that he is at. This is especially true after Jesus' resurrection. Following Jesus' resurrection, he has an encounter with Peter. And this is after Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Here Peter faces a triple question in parallel to his triple denial in John 21. Jesus asked Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter responds with slightly different words. "Yes, Lord, su oidas otiphilose, you know that I'm your friend." But he can't bring himself to say, "I love you." Jesus asks a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Same answer. "Yes, Lord, you know that I'm your friend." But he can't bring himself to say, "I love you." He can't bring himself to reach up to the place where Jesus is calling him to. So Jesus asks a third time. But this time he says, "Simon, son of John, are you my friend?" Peter's distraught. He thinks Jesus has dropped the bar, that he's lowered the expectations here, that everything has gone wrong. But I think Peter shouldn't have been upset here. This was Jesus' way of meeting Peter where he was at, of saying, "All right, Peter, if that's where you are, then that's where we'll start. We want to get to I love you, but if all you can say at the moment is I'm your friend, that's okay. We'll start right there." Perhaps some of you are here today with that same situation that Peter was in, of saying, "I'm not ready to go all the way. The expectations seem too high. I can't bring myself to go there." And if that's you today, I believe Jesus' message fundamentally is that he's still here to say, "That's all right. If that's where you are, then that's where we'll start. Now follow me." Amen.